and it's in the breaking. We come unbound, and it's in the giving. We are found, yeah. You could barely change.
Welcome to A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, a podcast dedicated to the telling of authentic stories and the sharing of insightful wisdom, exploring science and spirituality, medicine and Mother Nature. No topic is off limits when it comes to growing our personal understanding and supporting our collective well-being. With your host, Dr. Rob Abbott, a family medicine resident practicing spiritually focused and evolutionarily informed functional medicine, we hope to nourish your being so that you can flourish in whatever the moment has called for you to do.
And I know you try.
In episode 35 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, I welcome back the curious citizen scientist, Benjamin Richardson. In part 1 of the series, episode 31 to be exact, Benjamin introduced us to intermittent fasting, the fasting mimicking diet, and the role of personalized experimentation to discover what your body really needs to remain well. In this conversation, Benjamin leads us into a discussion of personalized carbohydrate testing, insulin resistance, and a thoughtful examination of all the reasons we choose to eat the food that we do. We start out the podcast with Benjamin sharing some background behind his reason for undertaking another self-experiment, this time to meticulously monitor his blood sugar in response to various foods and eating environments. Together, we delve into the implications of personalized glucose testing and tailoring one's diet to avoid large fluctuations in blood sugar. Benjamin then explains some of his own personal findings as part of the experiment and describes the importance of understanding all of the inputs outside of just diet, such as sleep, stress, and chronic disease burden that can influence someone's insulin and blood sugar response to certain foods. Benjamin then moves us into a thoughtful inquiry of the many reasons we humans choose to eat the food that we do. Benjamin offers his thoughts on the concept of eating for pleasure, his flexitarian approach, and explores the implications of one's food choices on the health, or lack thereof, of one's gut microbiota. This is another wonderful discussion with Benjamin, and I am honored to have his efforts and wisdom as part of our podcast. Be sure to check out the podcast page where Benjamin has provided a wealth of links and additional resources related to the conversation today. And lastly, I wanted to also share some exciting news, as I have recently partnered with my close friends, Ryan Hall and Carrie Cooper, and starting our newest and perhaps biggest wellness endeavor, the Charlottesville Center for Functional Medicine. While I will still be in Front Royal, Virginia for the next 2 years as part of my family medicine residency training, we are already laying the foundations for discovering whole being wellness in the city of Charlottesville. You can explore our new homepage at civofunctionalmedicine.com. That's spelled CVILLEFXMED.com, as well as our Facebook page to find out more about upcoming free community workshops. And with that, let's dig into the show. Well, Benjamin, thank you so much for coming back on the show for a part 2 of this podcast exploration into health span and longevity and just personalized nutrition. I'm really excited for this second podcast.
Hey, Rob. Lovely to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
You know, I don't think I said this in the first podcast, but it's your job now to help me on the other side of the ocean. I need to expand the audience into the UK, and I think you're the person to help me do so.
Hey, I love the idea. Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff you're doing really just me. So you've gained at least one new subscriber. But hey, if we can make it 10 or 100, even better, right?
Yeah. I've really resonated with your generosity, given some time and sort of authentic interest in this space. So I perhaps if people did not listen to the first episode with you, perhaps you can just give people a quick recap of who you are and what exactly we've been talking about.
Sure. So I'm just a regular guy, but I'm very passionate about pursuit of what I call health span. So living longer, but via improving kind of my health, which gives me benefits now and also benefits later in terms of I live long and prosper. To that end, I kind of search out and look for little n equals one person experiments, which might enable me to make some smarter choices, some better choices, which will lead to that health span. My day job is completely unrelated. I do not have kind of qualifications in this field, but I practice with things like fasting, like glucose testing, like switching things around my diet, trying to figure out what works well for me, and then what I'm also really passionate about is sharing that, which helps me challenge and kind of cement my own learning, but also gives other people the opportunity to basically kind of leverage what I've done and kind of do it themselves, try it out. So I blog for that purpose, and I prepare do-it-yourself guides, which are intended to be fairly simple and straightforward.
Well, I think having gone through them and looked at your page, they are quite accessible and straightforward and just meticulously designed. You can tell you have a detail-oriented mind, and it's so well thought out and organized. So for anyone listening, if you haven't listened to part one, it's not a prerequisite for this podcast, but I would certainly go back and take a listen to episode 31, where we talk a little bit about intermittent fasting and the concept known as the fasting mimicking diet. And it's just it's a wonderful discussion getting into those concepts of restricted eating and fasting. And so check that out, and some of the links embedded there. There's a lot of great information, kind of a web of science of sorts blossoming from that. But today I wanted to get into a conversation a little more personalized nutrition, but specifically with something you just mentioned, this idea of carb or glucose testing. And I think I say that, and people might be asking, well, are we talking about diabetes? You're talking about diabetics checking their blood sugar, and I think that's probably not what you mean by carb and glucose testing. So perhaps you can give people a little rundown of what you mean when you use those terms.
Well, sure. So by glucose testing, I'm really just referring to testing your own personal blood glucose response to different foods, including, but certainly, as you mentioned, not limited to carbohydrate, since you can also look at your blood glucose response to kind of fats, to proteins, and to mixed meals, which is what you would normally eat, of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins and fiber together. It's a relatively simple thing to do, and yes, you mentioned diabetics, and they would pretty much naturally be doing it, but it's also something which could be enormously helpful, insightful, and provide actionable kind of insights for people that are not diabetic. They could be pre-diabetic, or they might just be wanting to kind of improve their insulin sensitivity. Because ultimately, blood glucose, I see it as a proxy for insulin sensitivity. So if you understand well your blood glucose profile, you're basically getting insight into your insulin sensitivity, or the flip side of that, insulin resistance. And of course, you don't want resistance, and you do want sensitivity.
Yeah. Well, that's a great sort of introduction and background. I know some people are probably listening and wondering, well, why should I care about insulin sensitivity or this resistance? If I'm healthy and the doctor says I'm fine, I'm not a diabetic, why should I care?
Yeah, so you should. And generally, I'd say that, I'm going to make up a stat, but it's probably not too far off. It was something I read very recently in, I think, something like The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Kind of Living by Folek and Vinny. And they quoted some stat, which is something like, around about 40% of the US population now is either diabetic or pre-diabetic. So, you've got basically something that's well beyond an epidemic. But ultimately, insulin resistance, is not something which is like on or off. It's not like binary. It exists on a spectrum where you can progress over time towards, increased insulin resistance, which is a bad thing. And so here's the selling point. One is your blood glucose or your insulin is the closely related. So blood glucose is a good proxy and it's easy to measure. Insulin sensitivity itself has an enormous influence on a whole range of different health outcomes. So let's just say it's related to all-cause mortality or morbidity. It's strongly influenced over time by the dietary choices that you make day to day, in addition to your own genetics. It varies hugely between people. And testing your own blood glucose can basically enable you to make smarter choices for you. So, in other words, it's hugely impactful upon lots of different health outcomes. You're in control, and testing can basically give you information which lets you make smart choices.
Yeah, I'm so glad you put it in those terms. This idea of a spectrum, I think it's very difficult in medicine where we want black or white answers, or when we get really specific, when we look at certain labs and we create reference ranges or cutoffs for calling something a disease. I can't count, the times I've met people and asked them, are you a diabetic or have a history of diabetes? And they say, no, but my doctor told me I'm pre-diabetic. And I hate that term because it's basically an attempt to describe that spectrum. But like you just said, it's not like it's an on-off thing. With a fasting blood sugar, say of 110, which doesn't meet our current standards for diabetes of greater than 126. But that's pretty alarming. Like I want to know what's going into metabolically that situation for a person. And the reality is there's tons of inputs. I did my own personal experiment, one wanting to know what it's like to check your blood sugar 3 times a day, because I don't want to tell my patients to do this if I have no idea what it feels like. And it was astonishing to see, at least on paper, my diet is, there's nothing that I could do to try harder on paper to eat a better diet. Now, when it comes to stress management, my meditation practice, and sleep, there's sometimes some room for growth. And I found, interestingly, that the 2 biggest factors that would influence my fasting blood sugar or blood sugar after certain meals was my duration and quality of sleep, and if I had meditated or had my yoga practice for that day. So, it was very informative for me to see this sort of spectrum, because, one morning I might wake up and I might have a pre-diabetic blood sugar, and that was like pretty alarming. But what was nice to know is I could learn from that and find out, well, what was the input that caused it. So I say all this basically to tell people, if you are seeing your doctor or you're in the health space, we have to start seeing things as spectrums, even if it's more difficult for us. The black-white distinction really just is not, it's only applicable to a very, small number of things in medicine. And this, insulin resistance and, blood sugar is certainly one of those that lies on the spectrum. So I was curious, before we get in a little bit more, what are your thoughts on just that idea in general within medicine, and how can we help people, how can we educate people as clinicians to see that? Because I feel like they come to us wanting definitive answers, and sometimes we can't explain to them that it's a little gray.
Yeah, well, we have. I'm going to mention a couple of issues in the UK, which is one is that there's a current advocacy that general practitioners, which is our kind of doctors, our family doctor equivalents, they should be able and they should be confident to prescribe diet and exercise practices as opposed to prescribing pills and potions. But one, our GPs are not necessarily equipped in terms of education or self-awareness to do this. And 2, even if they were, they're up against a fairly entrenched attitude of, I go to the doctor in order to get a magic pill, which will whatever it is that is ailing me, So what do you mean are you telling me to take exercise? That's not your job. Stop being nanny, So that's going on at the moment. There's a bit of a kind of a debate, how can kind of clinicians actually encourage people to take more control, more responsibility, but also feel empowered and feel encouraged and feel supported to look after their own health.
Yeah, it's a delicate, and to me, it's a delicate balance, and it's an art. Having to see how to hold that kind of space, and push people, support them at the same time, and you'll step on people's toes. You will make people angry, and actually having a practice to not depersonalize it, but to not take things personally, at least as a clinician, has really helped me to engage in sometimes those more difficult conversations. I guess, kind of changing gears a little bit, and maybe even, stepping back, people are probably listening and they say, okay, well, I kind of get your thoughts regarding, well, even if I'm not a diabetic, how can this be helpful? How can testing my blood sugar or being aware of my blood sugar around meals and, in the morning, how that can be helpful? But they're, probably wondering, well, how did you even get interested in this in the first place? Something tells me it's more than just like your pure curiosity. Was there something that inspired this exploration?
Yeah, there's one big spark for it, which was there's an ongoing study and project called the Personalized Nutrition Project. It's being run by the Weizmann Institute based in Israel. And it's delivered two huge kind of headlines. And it was the second of these which really caught my attention. And the second of these was basically that people's blood glucose response to foods varies hugely. And they've got some really kind of mind-boggling contrasts, like you can give one person donuts, or you can give two people donuts, and you can then give the same two people, say, some whole wheat bread, and the first person might actually have a bigger blood glucose response to the whole wheat bread than they do to the donut, and that doesn't make any sense. Our best tools until this project for predicting the blood glucose or insulin response to a meal was simply the glycemic index value and the glycemic load. And what they set out was, well, that's got predictive power of, it's got a certain level of predictive power, but they've developed this kind of this new algorithm which takes into account a whole bunch of factors, including your gut microbiota, your personal genetics, and it's got so much greater predictive power that they can actually build kind of personalized dietary plan around it. And one of their key tools was basically blood glucose testing in response to meals. And this tool is available to you at home, basically, to use yourself. So although you can't join the program unless you're actually in Israel right now, you can actually make use of some of the benefits from it in terms of, hey, I can get insights too.
Wow, yes, that's a wonderful explanation of this study. I was exposed to it as well. I think at the same time with Rob Wolf described it on his podcast, and kind of in his idea of how he developed his own sort of 7-day carb test, incorporating this, personalized nutrition, personalized glycemic response to foods. And I have the study right here. And, when I found the study, it's so fascinating to go through. And I still don't understand quite all the inputs that they put in to create this amazing algorithm that has a tremendous predictive value for your glycemic response and what should be your quote unquote optimal diet, at least based on these selected parameters and primarily insulin sensitivity. It's really just fascinating to me that we're getting this prescriptive with dietary choices. And like I said, stepping back, yes, we recognize there are other inputs into this system, sleep, stress management, other environmental loads that can affect this. But it's pretty fascinating to me that we are getting to this level of research when it comes to the role of certain foods and diet to impact our health. And as you mentioned before, it's technically sort of freely accessible. These tools, the method is accessible to the layperson. And while it's certainly going to take some time, and I think you're going to explain to us what that whole process looked like, it is accessible nonetheless. And I guess I do want to step back just a little bit. You used a few terms in that initial explanation. You use the words glycemic load and glycemic index, and we've been talking about this glycemic response, and these may be somewhat scientific foreign terms for some people. So I was wondering if you would be able to explain what you mean by, or what we mean by, glycemic index versus glycemic load versus this general glycemic response.
Well, sure, I'll have a go, and you'll correct me if I get it wrong.
That's sure thing.
So glycemic index is basically a rating given to foods, largely carbohydrates, which indicates what is going to be the insulin or the blood glucose response when you consume them. So it's a scale, basically 1 to 100. Glucose, pure glucose, has a rating of 100, and typically other foods have different ratings. So you can have foods which are relatively low glycemic index, are things that you would think of as being things like complex carbohydrates or proteins or fat, which typically provoke less of a blood glucose and insulin response when you consume them. And things which are higher up on the scale are, your refined carbohydrates, things like table sugar, donuts usually. So you've got basically a scale, and you can Google this, and you can find like examples of foods which are in kind of low, medium, and high. And anyone that's kind of at risk of diabetes or is already diabetic will already be using this as like a key tool in helping to guide their dietary choices. But again, as you say, they're not the only ones who can actually take advantage from using it to guide their dietary choices. And then glycemic load, well, that's a pretty simple equation, which is okay, so glucose has a glycemic index of 100, but then the blood glucose response to it when you consume glucose is going to be determined by not just the index, but also how much of it you are consuming. So it's literally just factors in the number of net grams of carbohydrates that you're consuming in a food to multiply that by the index value and give you the glycemic load. And the glycemic load is really the combination of the grams and the index, which is enabler to predict what should your response be to a given food. And that was the kind of key tool prior to the new gold standard being introduced by this personalized nutrition project.
That was a great description, and I want people to focus in on that very key distinction you just described for us. This glycemic load realistically is the more practical tool, because if you just look at the glycemic index of certain foods without the context of how much you typically eat, you can look at something like carrots and be like, oh my goodness, carrots have a glycemic index of and I'm making this up, it is quite high. I shouldn't eat carrots. Or like watermelon. But the reality is, in the terms of the amounts you're going to eat when compared to certain foods, the glycemic load is actually much less, and then you factor in all the other, phytonutrients and antioxidants in that food. So it can be easy to get led astray when you just simply look at the glycemic index and forget to look at the glycemic load, or the reality of how do we eat, in these amounts and context of a meal. And then, as you also pointed out, we just have this as a starting place. We have no idea really what your personal response is going to be. And what the study showed is actually, so for some people, that glycemic index and glycemic load was not predictive. They had a completely sort of paradoxical response. And this is where we get into this realm of, well, what do we start prescribing people to eat? Do we prescribe them donuts because this algorithm says that their blood sugar actually looks better with donuts than it does with bananas? When I read this study, I was starting to struggle. Like, should I be prescribing this type of diet for people? Because it just seems completely antithetical to the concept of nutrient density and just what I know to be true from an ancestral perspective. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, one, we'll start with, what was your experience like doing this testing, and what were some of the things that you found as a result?
I went in again with kind of setting what are my kind of goals, my personal goals, because what I was pretty confident of, or what I already had information to tell me, was that my insulin sensitivity is already pretty good. So I did not have a problem to address as such. I was instead looking for, are there any even better choices I can make which would have a positive impact upon my long-term development of insulin sensitivity, or my long-term maintenance? So I was looking to explore, basically, are there any particular foods which I have an abnormal reaction to? And are there any practices or behaviors which I should either start or stop or continue? And, finding that those things which I should continue, well, that's fine. If it's basically a validation of stuff I'm already doing, that's good. I don't need to make changes if I'm already kind of making the right choices. So, and the other thing is that I was very familiar and inspired by the fantastic, Rob Wolf 7-day carb test, which you already mentioned. the reason I didn't follow that is that is kind of focused on just testing individual carbohydrates or foods which are almost exclusively carbohydrate. And I think that's
Yes.
very interesting, but translating that into kind of real world practice is a bit more limited, especially if you're not normally going to be eating those carbohydrates anyway, or you fact that your meals are usually combined kind of protein, fats, and carbs. And again, a little throw in from that personalized nutrition project study is completely defying expectations. They found that when they tested people consuming glucose with bread plus butter. Well, what glycemic load would tell us is that the glucose consumption would provoke the highest response. And if you have kind of the complex carbohydrate in bread plus fat, then that should provoke a much lower response. And again, that was true quite a lot of the time, but certainly not for everybody. So what I was looking
Yeah.
for was where are my abnormalities?
Yeah.
What interesting things can I find? But here's the thing. In my first round of testing, I really didn't find anything for myself that wouldn't have been predicted from the glycemic load. So I tested a bunch of carbohydrates that I was interested in eating in my diet. I tested some complete kind of meals, which are typical to the kind of foods I eat. And I tested some kind of protein snack bars. And the things which provoked the highest kind of blood sugar spikes for me were the things that were highest basically in glycemic load and index. So it was like a snack bar which
Yeah.
was high in date sugar. It was some simple carbohydrate meal like a refined garlic bread. So that's okay because it basically tells me that those kind of typical foods which you want to eat in moderation anyway, I should eat them in moderation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really resonate with, and this is how the study was performed. Like you said, the practicality of, we don't just eat one isolated carbohydrate. And while that is great from sort of a scientific methodology to construct, like, well, I know specifically that white rice was the thing that, spiked my blood sugar because that's the only thing I ate when I measured it. We don't really eat in these vacuums. And the other thing too is, wanting to have people eat things that they either are interested to eat or are currently eating. Like that's really what I want to know. I'm not really curious to know what my response is to things that I'm just never going to touch with, with a 10-foot pole. It's not really interesting to me. And it's where we can get into this concept too of, this personalized testing. There's other ways to look at this, from a clinician standpoint. I've looked into some of the testing for wheat sensitivity, and Cyrex Labs has some interesting panels looking at multiple antibodies and antibody complexes to various components of wheat, far beyond just the sort of antibodies that are espoused in traditional medicine for diagnosing a celiac disease. And that's been actually really helpful to see in the context of some other case studies in helping people navigate can I eat wheat? Should I eat wheat? Is gluten this terrible thing? And, using the testing with the person's personal experience. At the end of the day, I need to know what the person feels like. Yes, there can be an underlying sort of chronic inflammatory pattern that's happening without sort of this conscious awareness, but I want to know what the person's experience is. But we can use these kinds of tests, the testing for gluten sensitivity or reactivity to certain components of the gluten molecule, and these personalized nutrition glycemic focused tests to really inform our dietary choices, because I think we're getting to a point where it's pretty hard to listen to popular media or even like the diet space, people well-meaning to prescribe diets, because it's just it can become so dogmatic very quickly. So I say all this to sort of get your personal belief on what is the role of maybe public health or a clinician in helping people be guided to the right diet for them.
Gosh, I mean, again, that's a huge question. So if you're asking kind of what your kind of family doctor can do, I think maybe role number one is to, ensure that they've got sufficient education and interest themselves in what we know today based upon contemporary research of what makes for good diets. because what I'm also familiar with is that in your typical clinicians, kind of maybe 5 6 years of training before they get qualified and can start practicing, they might have had just a handful of hours of kind of training or education focused upon human nutrition. And I know that's changing as well. I believe that's changing, but it means that a lot of kind of GPs, even if they're very interested in this area and they're motivated to help their patients, they're starting from themselves a very low knowledge base. So maybe step one is just to kind of acquire the knowledge base. Maybe there's another step, which is to kind of follow the kind of functional medicine kind of route, which is, hey, partner up with the people that can actually already have this knowledge, so that you can kind of adopt a holistic approach to, well, we want to look at the whole human, and we want to look at not just, there's a like some we diagnose, we name the thing which is ailing you, and then we prescribe the solution for it. But why don't we try and go all the way back to kind of the different causal factors, and actually not wait for a problem to develop, but talk about preventative interventions, so positive lifestyle practices. And so this goes back to prescribing those positive lifestyle practices, and not in response to a problem, but as an opportunity. So it's then about stepping into the role of actually educating the public or educating your patients, outside of the kind of the normal paradigm of people coming to you with something which is already developed well beyond the point where you could have solved it through an earlier intervention.
You can be my marketing director, or just the marketing spokesperson for so many, functional minded clinicians. That's a beautiful description of that process and the relationship that I'm trying to cultivate with my patients. And here's the scary thing, as you pointed out, I was looking at a survey pretty recently. It was about a month ago in Medscape, one of our major medical news outlets, and they basically were polling doctors and asked them, "Are you comfortable with do you have enough nutrition education? Are you comfortable with making these recommendations to your patients?" And it was something like they did separate between cardiologists and lay people, mainly because cardiology has gotten a lot of press about the Mediterranean diet and these things. But the scary thing was, it was like something like 75 or 80% of people said, "No, I don't feel like I have enough education and I don't feel comfortable." 80% of these clinicians were saying that, and saying we need more, and that's terrifying. I recognized it personally when I was in medical school, when I was being exposed to functional medicine, that I was not going to get this type of education unless I went out and sought it myself. And was that unfair? Maybe. Should I have been given a better education for that $200,000 of medical debt that I have now? Maybe. But the reality was, I had to take it into my own hands, and maybe I wouldn't even have wanted to have the nutrition education that they were providing me, because maybe it was actually, I was finding it to be sort of false when I really looked at some other inputs and some other areas of nutrition. So yes, it's terrifying. We can't, doctors aren't going to be prescribing these things if they don't feel comfortable with that knowledge and don't have that background. So I think you're right. There needs to be maybe a foundational education. And I joke, some doctors, we need to take like a 6-month sabbatical and just go back to med school, except make it functional medical school, and go back and learn nutrition. Spend 2 months just doing that, and spend 2 months on empowering patients to make positive habit changes. There's a lot of things that we could do much better when it comes to continuing education and relearning and adapting for the moment. But I really appreciate that you've kind of given us the description and your personal beliefs around the sort of doctor-patient relationship. And kind of stepping back to your personal experience with this glucose testing, it sounds like you didn't learn anything dramatic, more so that you're personally sort of following with the glycemic response, and maybe that's an indicator that you're metabolically quite flexible and in good health. I wanted to get your thoughts on, well, if you didn't really learn anything specific from this glycemic testing on I should avoid this food or eat this food, what are you using to inform your dietary choices at this point?
Well, I will just mention one thing I did learn was that So I actually did this testing again with. I say again because we in our last podcast we talked about the fasting mimicking diet, and I said that I partnered up with like a buddy to do this simultaneously, which was hugely helpful. I did that again with the blood glucose testing, and by contrast to the other guy, when I consumed basically highly refined starch products, including some gluten-free bread and gluten-free pizza and gluten-free garlic bread, my glucose response to that was pretty modest. Certainly far lower than his, and I returned to well below the kind of 2 hour baseline for kind of normal glucose, even though I got a spike from these foods. So that prompts me to say, hey, I wonder if maybe there's an explanation for that in the number of AMY1 or amylase gene copies I've got, which is kind of a gene variant, or gene copy, which is really strongly correlated with adaptation to higher starch diets. So
Is that, I'll just interrupt there. Is that for amylase genes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The amylase salivary kind of variant. So yes, so it's known that the more gene copies you've got, the more adapted you are to higher starch diets. I think having a lower number of copies is also correlated with higher risk of obesity if you're on a high starch diet. So it's got me interested in saying, hey, maybe I've got a significant number of copies, and maybe that explains why I appear to have a pretty muted response to these starchy foods, which I would expect to elevate my blood sugar. What it also meant is because I was testing both in the morning and in the evening, rather than just in the morning, as the Rob Wolf protocol would do. Because I was looking for, there's a phenomenon called, one name for it is evening diabetes, which is where your blood sugar insulin response in the evening can be significantly different from what it is in the morning, which you might not realize, but which again might then kind of prompt you to make different choices in the evening. Like you might have higher protein meals, you might make sure you've got lots of fiber in your meals, you might vary the order of the foods that you eat. Again, I didn't observe that, so that means that there's no thing for me to start doing differently. But I mean, it was still a good takeaway in terms of this validation of most of the practices which I'm already following. So I got value from it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, that's go ahead.
And I mean, for my next steps, I mean, it's definitely for me stimulated great interest in doing maybe to experiment where I increase my dietary carbohydrate. Because at the moment I'm kind of on a low carbohydrate diet, but not a very low carbohydrate diet, and not a ketogenic diet. So what I'd love to do is actually experiment with increased carbohydrate and also experiment with basically a well-formulated ketogenic diet. So to going in two different directions, and then see, well, which of those produces the preferable set of outcomes in terms of how I feel, but also things like my HbA1c, which of course is an average measure over a number of weeks of your fasted blood sugar or your blood sugar, generally. My fasted blood sugar, my cholesterol, maybe my exercise performance, my heart rate variability. So in other words, taking a basket of measures and saying, hey, which of these kind of diets, ketogenic, very low carb, higher carb, my current, is actually something that I want to follow long term. So it's basically been the setup for that next step.
It's beautiful. I mean, you can take this in so many directions, and you're right. I didn't mean to shortchange you on the value that you got from the experiment. It was funny. I was thinking about that. I was like, man, I did not phrase that as the way I was thinking. But you're right. It's interesting. You're probably pleasantly surprised that, well, man, I was eating these more refined foods. Maybe I should have had and doing this with a buddy. Why wasn't my response were a higher response? And it certainly isn't a reason to go and just eat that 24/7. I bet from your overall health and metabolic flexibility that you've probably, and maybe some genetic predispositions in that sort of positive direction, will allow you to quote unquote get away with other foods that on paper may not be as nutritionally dense or have a higher glycemic load. It's an idea that one of my friends, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and I were talking about back at the Ancestral Health Symposium last fall, was this idea of, we need to create resilient, we're evolved to be resilient organisms. So if I'm only able to eat broccoli, rice, and stir-fried chicken, and that's the only thing that makes me feel okay so I can be functional and that my cells will accept, you're not very resilient. I mean, how many places are you going to be where you can only eat that? And so his point was like, we need to be resilient. So if in a situation, if all there is Doritos, I need to be able to try to handle those Doritos. Otherwise, I'm going to be a less resilient organism. And so it was just an interesting argument, trying to basically say, like, is there a way to, one, measure this degree of probably metabolic flexibility or resiliency, but two, just helping people who perhaps get a little super narrow focused with their dietary choices, that really what we want is flexibility, we want resiliency. And that's perhaps where I wanted to maybe direct and end this conversation, is because you, I think, have this flexibility mindset and approach in lots of, a lot of what you do, and very specifically in dietary choices, and would love for you to maybe explain to folks what you see as being, flexible, or what you're calling a flexitarian template.
Sure, flexitarian. And what you were mentioning there about kind of the diversity of your diet, well, one, that would be part of my dietary template, but it really kind of prompts me to just make mention of something which might be of great interest to you and your listeners as well. Is there's a past kind of twins researcher, now researcher into the gut microbiota, so the bacteria that live in your gut, based in the UK, a guy called Tim Spector. He leads the British Gut Project, which is the partner program for the American Gut Project, led by Rob Knight in the US. And I've seen him kind of deliver seminars, kind of explaining, well, here's the kind of what we know from research into gut microbiota and into human health. And one of the things he emphasizes is the importance of diversity in the diet. And given it's kind of a bit of a counterweight to the popularity of a lot of diet recommendations you see now, which is you need to cut out, an entire food group, or you need to cut out an entire macronutrient, and this is your, magic path towards perfect health. And he kind of
for the rest of your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he counters this by emphasizing that actually his messages, include things. So pursue a diverse diet. You can use concepts like, rainbow on a plate, but keep things in rather than take things out. And it's a bit of like a fun experiment which he shares. He had his son actually go on like a 10-day diet where all he ate was McDonald's meals or something, like burgers. And his son, who was a university student at the time, he was really keen to do this. Initially, first like 1 or 2 days, and then he started feeling not so good. But the thing that they measured was that his son lost something like 40% of the diversity of his gut microbiota within this 10-day period, which is, bringing back to your term, made him a much less resilient and much less adaptive organism. Because it basically meant he no longer had the bacterial cultures, which let him actually make use of different foods he was eating. So, bacteria do so many things. They extract energy, they extract nutrients, they actually produce some micronutrients, which, like B12, which you might not be getting directly from food. And he lost that diversity through, this restricted kind of diet. So anyway, long beginning to the answer is diversity is one of my kind of principles as a flexitarian, trying to make sure that every day I'm covering all the different colors, so purples, yellows, whites, greens, reds, etc., and make sure I've got that diversity from day to day. And within a day, that's one of the key principles of my diet.
Yeah, I love that. I remember reading that study as well, that, going on this sort of relatively refined garbage diet and having this significantly decreased diversity. And we're still, in the infancy of being able to interpret, at one phase, using a stool test, DNA test to look at the composition of the gut microbiota and say, is that a healthy gut microbiota, or is that a more robust? But we can look at the overall diversity, and there are so many implications that have been bore out in other research studies, looking at immune system, reactivity or flexibility, or as you just said, ability to synthesize and create nutrients, and all these other compounds that certain species and types of bacteria are able to make. So yeah, it's a perfect example of what can happen and if you think about it, if someone is on a fairly refined diet for years and years and years, there's almost no way that they're going to have an optimal composition. We might not know what optimal composition is, and it's going to vary for the individual, but based on that, sort of N=1 study and the other research in this area, we know that the implications of a poor and refined diet are massive, and starting in the gut is, to me, is a great place to look for those signs. There's some other things that you mentioned as well. So this diversity piece, and I think nutritional diversity is key. You talked about eating the rainbow. Are there and we've talked obviously here about sort of insulin sensitivity. Are there other things that you put an emphasis on in terms of the foods that you choose to eat, or as a clinician, maybe if someone's listening, what should be some of the other principles they should be thinking about when recommending a type of diet or types of foods for individuals?
Sure. So the other big ones from my perspective, the other big kind of influences are one is looking for nutrient density. And what I mean by that is I'm looking for the foods which relative to the number of calories they put into my diet, they're delivering a broad range and density and kind of a rich source of micronutrients. So your amino acids, your vitamins, your minerals, your essential fatty acids, and also your phytonutrients. So the things that we don't really have a lot of names for, but which we also know you find them in whole foods, and they have a very, very big positive impact upon a number of bodily functions and longevity. So nutrient density is something which I emphasize greatly in my food choices. And that kind of, maybe the flip side of that is energy density. So energy density is literally, per kind of gram of food, or maybe just how much you can easily consume in a kind of a serving size or a sitting, how many calories it's delivering. And a lot of, processed foods, a lot of kind of refined carbohydrate foods, they're going to deliver a heck of a lot of energy, calories, but deliver very, very few nutrients. And even when you kind of look at the packet, it says fortified with, X and Y. Yeah. I mean, so what's happened there is, it's emerged from, a very highly refined corn, soy, wheat, or potato kind of starch product. And because that product's got almost no nutritional value whatsoever, some, synthetic vitamins or some natural vitamins have been added back in. But contrast that with kind of a whole food, and, it offers a very, very weak proposition for taking up a significant part of your diet. So nutrient density and energy density, these are kind of two big players for me in the choices that I make.
Yeah, I love your description of the nutrient composition and breaking it into some of the micronutrients. One of the terms that has been brought up in the personalized nutrition article and in some other articles when looking at insulin sensitivity and health in general and looking at specific foods is this concept of an acellular carbohydrate. And carbohydrate is just one of the macronutrients. We have carbohydrates, we have proteins, we have fats, and we've maybe been focusing a little bit more on the carbohydrate just because we know its implications on stimulating insulin and its role in being broken down to the simple sugar glucose. But what this paper and some of these papers have been proposing is that it's what's really damaging or potentially damaging are these acellular carbohydrates. And well, how do you make an acellular carbohydrate? Well, you refine the product and basically strip it down so that it loses its matrix, it loses its structure. And then, we attempt to reconstitute a nutritional food by then adding back in, as you mentioned, maybe synthetic or even natural vitamins. But we lose the idea that what we've lost is the natural geometric structure of that whole food, because that natural vitamin, the whole food vitamin C, the way it's complex to a plant is integral for that plant. That's how it exists in structure. And so if you break that structure and then try to reintroduce some ascorbic acid, but you've lost the relationship between the plant cellular structure and this vitamin as they exist in nature, it makes perfect sense to me how if we ingest it, it's not going to have the same effect, or bioavailability or what have you for the human organism. And so it it boggles my mind that we think, that they think that we can refine these foods and then reintroduce nutrients and expect to see, the same type of positive benefit that maybe the whole food that contains those nutrients has. And it's one of the debates about, all the studies that have looked at vitamin supplementation, and really just hasn't panned out to be much, much of a benefit, and or even any of the public health initiatives that have been started to, add in certain nutrients into sort of the global diets of whether it's iron or folic acid. And, these these types of measures haven't really worked out. And like I said, boil it back to like, well, what is the structure? What is the interaction? And I'm a chemist, so I nerd out on wanting to know where exactly, what bonds are happening between certain amino acids and proteins and certain sugars, because that to me that gets into the enzymatic process of how any of this happens. And I don't know, that was a big ramble, but I really wanted people to understand when we talk about the difference between these foods, we need to get kind of granular to see like what really is the difference between a whole food and its nutrients and these refined products. I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts about that, having sort of prefaced this initially with your discussion about sort of nutrient density and these micronutrients.
I mean, certainly what you're describing in terms of the kind of the acellular kind of food, I've seen direct kind of research which has looked at, for example, take chickpeas, or I think your US listeners might use term garbanzo beans. And if you compare consumption of the kind of the whole garbanzo bean with consumption of hummus, now I love hummus, right? So nothing against hummus, but in the preparation of hummus from garbanzo beans, you basically subjecting the beans to a level of processing which basically breaks down the cell walls, which means that you, the human, or the bacteria in your gut, doesn't need or doesn't have the opportunity to break down those cell walls. And there's kind of research which shows that therefore the kind of the value of the hummus relative to beans to your microbiota, which as evidenced by their enzymatic activity and the actual number of kind of bacteria you have within a given family, and the glycemic response again to it varies. So basically the same kind of food, but just convert it into a more highly processed form of that food, and bingo. It's of different value to your body. It's of different value to the bacteria, which you have a symbiotic relationship with, literally just because of the breakdown of that cell wall.
And people, I might interrupt here, people are probably like, well, it's the same food. Why does it matter? It's a chickpea. A chickpea is a chickpea. But what you're saying is actually not true. Am I correct?
Pretty much, yeah. The form in which you eat food is important. And generally speaking, now I think there's also a bit of a caveat here, in that, in order to consume a significant volume of, let's say, whole foods or very fibrous foods, you've got to start off from a position of having robust gut health. So if you
Yes.
go from a position where you've got a diet very high in refined kind of corn, soy, wheat, potato products, maybe you've got a very low diversity kind of gut microbiota, and you try and transition directly from that into kind of a whole foods diet, which is very rich in fiber, then it could go badly wrong. Because your body isn't ready to help you kind of deal with that huge change. So this is again where I see a significant role for a kind of clinical professional to step in and help guide that process of, okay, how do we actually reset the kind of the gut health? How do we kind of transition onto a more sustainable dietary template, which is not a quick fix, it's just a lifestyle.
Yeah, it's a beautiful relationship that has to be much more nuanced. I agree. We can see people all the time who suddenly want to go and start on a healthy diet and introduce all this new fiber and these other fancy term of these microbiota accessible carbohydrates, these previously not present fibers and cell walls of certain plants, produce that are being now suddenly coming into the colon and the anthropomorphizing, but the bacteria in the gut are probably something like, well, where did all this food come from? Where did all this this fiber come from? And and suddenly there's this new food source, and it makes sense. You can already go from one state of relative dysbiosis to another potential state of dysbiosis simply by modifying the food load, the prebiotic load that the bacteria are seeing, and it's something that you're right. We need nutritionists. We need functionally minded clinicians who have an understanding of this, who realize that we are not just eating for ourselves. We are eating for our microbiota. We are eating for this living organism, this symbiotic living organism within our gut, within our skin, within sort of almost the entirety of our body. And so I tell people in my clinic, when it comes down to making food choices, we make food choices for ourselves, and we make food choices for our bacteria. And then in between, we're making food choices for the health of this complex organism we're calling a human bacterial organism. And
Right.
and when you give people that foundational education about food choices beyond just what I should be doing for my health, and then you suddenly enter this whole new there's this whole gut microbiota and these bacterial organisms that actually are feeding on the things that you feed it, and they can help you if you give them the right fuel. It's really fascinating to see people when they suddenly get that and actually get inspired to make better food choices and actually make food choices for their gut, maybe more so than for their personal palate. That being said, I know we want to eat food for a pleasurable experience. We want to enjoy what we eat. We want to take value in perhaps where it's been grown from or what it took to produce that food. And I know that's a big, important, a big feature of your life, and wanted to at least spend some time here allowing you to explain what really is pleasure around food, and how should we be cultivating a relationship with food with that regard.
I'm actually conflicted on that. So I mean, food and eating socially, eating with friends and family is an enormous source of pleasure. I try and apply kind of a mindful approach to food to think about. So I've trained as a chocolate taster, and you can actually get a certification in chocolate tasting. And
That's
oh
awesome.
yeah,
I need to sign up for that.
it's really fun. But that kind of guides you through a process where before you're about to actually, take a bite of chocolate, you hold it and you think about, well, where does this come from? So imagine imagine the environment in which the cacao tree is growing, and then the people that would be involved in harvesting that cacao, and then the process of taking it from kind of the cacao bean through the different stages before it actually reaches you in the form of a bar of chocolate. So just think about that process. Think about where it's come from, who's been involved in it, where it's been, etc. How it's been processed. And then it kind of guides you through, well, what are the qualities of the chocolate? So, you look at, the visual experience. Is it shiny? Is it glossy? Is it matte? Is it kind of uniform? Does it have variation in color? And then maybe you hold it up to your ear and you snap it, and you're going to break it, and you say, do you hear a nice clean snap? And then you're going to bring it very close, you bring it very slowly. You take a small piece and you bring it into your mouth and you bite down there, and then you just let it melt at kind of body temperature. And you do that because chocolate melts at kind of body temperature, so it'll melt in the mouth. You do not need to chew. Don't chew it. And then you experience the range of flavors that comes through. Now, this is about and this gives you kind of a completely different experience to just kind of picking up a candy bar and going chomp, 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 chomp. Yeah, that was nice. It kind of really gives you a connection to the food that you're eating. And of course,
Yeah.
I'm describing this with chocolate, but you can do it with anything. You can choose to kind of actually focus on the food you're eating instead of your mobile phone or the TV program or any other kind of distraction. And actually doing that has multiple benefits. One is you can derive a heck of a lot more pleasure from what you're eating. Two is you can be a lot more aware of, are you feeling full? Three is you can actually begin to differentiate between, are you actually hungry, or do you just have appetite, which means
Yes, the satiety signals.
Absolutely. You could even kind of go into applying the one of the Japanese approaches to eating, which is basically to aim to be 80% full, because there's about a 20-minute delay between kind of taking in food and getting the satiety, the satiation effect from eating that food. So by slowing down the pace and thinking about what you're doing, you can actually, enable yourself to kind of reduce your caloric intake and help take control of your weight, if that's something which is important to you. So all those things are good things. I haven't mentioned the caveat, but all those things are good things, and they're all things that I practice, and that absolutely does kind of enhance my enjoyment from the food that I eat.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here now thinking, one of my close friends, Stefan Guillenet, has probably devoted so much of his, or not probably, has devoted so much of his life researching this idea of hyperpalatable foods and constructing, he wrote this amazing book of, why do we overeat? And it's a fascinating read. I encourage anyone listening, check that out. I had a conversation with him early on in the podcast series, more about sort of the scientific community than the book itself. But it's a fascinating look at the sort of structure and this concept of these hyperpalatable foods, and when you start to mix in fat and sugar and starch and salt and even this MSG, you can create something that just completely takes your brain over, and you cannot stop eating. And I sort of, in hearing your description, I'm coming up with a new idea of, we should eat mindfully for pleasure, but not for palatability, or at least hyperpalatability. How can we, differentiate, eating for pleasure versus simply being consumed by hyperpalatability? And it's going to take effort, as you just described. I mean, it's pretty, even for the most mindful person, it can be pretty hard to not just grab the candy bar and eat the whole piece of, the whole bar of chocolate, but to really be purposeful and take a few moments to just sit with yourself and just to sit with the candy bar and the chocolate bar and start to ask, well, where did it come from? What were the inputs to make this even possible? And for some people, that's becoming their primary reason for choosing a food, is actually the environmental or sustainable aspect. They don't care about its nutrient density, or what it's maybe doing for their gut microbiome. They just care about what was the type of soil that it was grown in, what was the the farm life like for that animal, or what's the mission and the value system of the farmer and business who cultivated it. And to me, that's as wonderful a reason, if not better, for a reason to choose a way of eating is that kind of relationship. I've joked with patients before that I'd rather you eat a McDonald's cheeseburger, mindfully, fully present with your family, no technology, just being with that, than trying to eat some dates and walnuts in rush hour traffic, screaming at people next to you because you're late to a meeting. And it's just, I don't know. I'm so glad that you have found that and you've articulated it quite well. I know it sounds like there's a slightly darker side to this pleasure hyperpalatability complex, and would love to get your sort of thoughts on that.
Well, I'm really picking up on that mention of hyperpalatability. I might have actually read the book you're referring to as well. But there's kind of two kind of caveats I've mentioned. One is that indeed, because again, especially in the arena of processed food, we're basically now exposed to this experiment on the human race of what happens when you introduce these hyperpalatable foods. And what we're learning from that experiment, I think, is that it's not a question of willpower. Yes. I think if you put these foods in the environment around people, their willpower. I think the kind of the most modern concept is you've got like a bank of willpower, and you can make some withdrawals from that bank, but eventually you can get to the point where you reach kind of zero credit and you become overdrawn. And if you're continually surrounded by these hugely appealing kind of almost addictive, maybe not in the drug sense, but addictive kind of you really want them foods, then you're going to lose. Your willpower is going to lose. You're going to find yourself going into overdraft, and you're going to give in. And I think for me, one of the biggest kind of players in what contributes to our struggle with kind of weight and health is the idea of the obesinogenic environment. In that, in contrast to where we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, so much of our food is processed. So much of it is this hyperpalatability food, and it's everywhere. I mean, you're hardly ever more than 10 meters away from the nearest kind of food
Yeah.
machine or 7-Eleven or something similar. And so it encourages us to eat more often and eat more of these foods. So that's kind of one dark side. The other kind of slight dark side is, gosh, I'm going to get a bit esoteric here, but there was a Roman philosopher called Epicurus. I'm murdering his name probably, but so he had a school of philosophy known as Epicureanism. The modern day version of that might be hedonism, which is like seeking pleasure. So life's about maximizing pleasure and kind of minimizing pain. But here's the slight problem. If you kind of focus on food as pleasure, then ultimately you're going to crave more of that pleasure. I mean, that's natural, right? But the pleasure that you get from eating food is, of course, also fleeting. You can't be enjoying it all day. So if that's what you focus on and throw yourself into, there's a risk that you just want it more and more often, and that you're upset and you suffer pain when you cannot indulge. So I think there's finding pleasure in lots of different things is important rather than just finding it or kind of focusing on food being the main event. Food should be part of a kind of a healthy lifestyle. It shouldn't be kind of dominating your thoughts and your feelings all the way through the day.
That's an interesting point there at the end. I think something too that's evolved in sort of the family dynamics of both in, I think, European and American culture. I know it's something that I feel when I see American families nowadays. Everyone's doing stuff, and being able to come home and sit around the dinner table to share in each other's experiences is becoming less and less common. And food has to be involved in everything now. Like there has to be cupcakes at the party. There has to be insert food X into activity, and we lose sight of the real purpose of this was to come and sit together to be with each other. And I think it's something that a lot of the European countries, and when you go, and at least when I've traveled, it's an experience. You sit down for 2 hours with with your family, and you may enjoy food throughout, but the focus is really not the food. It's really being with each other and just that social atmosphere. And we've just told ourselves, and I'm really generalizing here, like I said, speaking about sort of the American culture, but we've gotten caught up in doing, and then we sort of realize, well, I have to eat in order to be alive, and then all of a sudden we are eating something that we probably shouldn't be eating. And I don't know, it's something that it motivates me to help bring back
And
some structure and hope in the family dynamic anyway.
And we talked about the blue zones, the studies of the longest lived people in the world.
Yes.
And again, one of the kind of features you see in their lifestyle is that they eat socially. So that they're sitting down, they're enjoying food with their family, with their friends. It's a social occasion. So it's not about just the food. It's about sharing the food and being together with other people as you're consuming it. So it's not like wolfing down a snack bar in your car on your way to work. It's not, taking a huge bag of popcorn in the cinema. It's about spending time with other people and enjoying and sharing food at the same time. Modern kind of routines and demands can, compete and conflict with that. But I think that is, again, it's a feature that you just see with the world's happiest, healthiest, longest lived people. So there's got to be something in it, right?
Yeah. There's got to be something in there. Benjamin, this has been so wonderful. I know, we planned before this to try to get into more a greater discussion into some other topics, but the moment was calling for a little bit deeper dive into aspects of nutrition and and this glucose testing. And so I want to probably end our conversation here so we can save the rest of just some of the nourishing notes that you provided for a part 3 or maybe even part 4. So thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me. I know it's getting close to your time to depart to bed.
Hey, good sleep's very important, but really enjoyed the chat. I talk about food all day and nutrition. Love the topic. Thanks ever so much for having me back, Rob. Much appreciated.
Of course. And, I wanted to try to stay away from some of the nitty-gritty details of how exactly you did this in the podcast, because you have a wonderful post and guide as you sort of alluded to earlier, for this test. And could you, let people know if they've been listening and they're super interested to do this sort of 7-day test, or to test their blood sugar, how can they learn more about the practical how-tos from your post?
Sure. I'm sure we'll put it in the kind of the show notes as well. But basically, I've got a blog, foreverfreefrom.com, and a couple of recent posts. One of them is basically providing a do-it-yourself guide combined with a shared Google sheet, which basically would let you kind of plan, record your results, etc. And it basically covers, why you'd want to do it, how you'd do it, suggestions from kind of choices you'd make. The idea is that you could come into it with kind of relatively low knowledge base and be able to replicate the protocol for yourself, and then actually kind of make new choices based upon the outcomes you get. And of course, because it's a blog, you can kind of throw in comments, and if you seek out any help or have any questions, and I'd be absolutely delighted to answer them. So if you head over to foreverfreefrom.com, look in the Living Well section, you'll find those recent guides. You'll find them there.
Wonderful. And he's got a wonderful table as well that shows, specifically the devices and the cost. And this is not something that is super cost prohibitive. And when we talk about our health, I don't think you can put a price tag on what health means to you. So once again, Benjamin, this has been great. And I can't wait to share this conversation with our audience, and then have you back again to dig more into just the citizen scientist that you are. It's fascinating.
Thank you, Rob.
All right, well, have a good day, my friend. And until next time, be well.
And you've got a bit more of the day left, and have a good one.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.